Testing 123, testing 1, 2, 3. Welcome to the CITRIS Lunch Lecture Series. My name is Greg Niemeyer. I am one of the researchers at CITRIS and a professor for new media at Berkeley. Before I introduce our speaker today, Professor Michael Neff, I want to thank Dr. Yvette Supermanian, Laurie Mariano, and Khosrow Taharian for their expertise in making this event possible. I also want to thank Professor Paul Wright for his excellent leadership as the director of CITRIS, which human agents normally call CITRIS. What do Dr. Alain Fortier, the eminent Canadian computer scientist, and Isadora Duncan, the eminent San Francisco dancer, have in common? They both have an award named after them, one for Best PhD Dissertation in Canada, one for Best Dance Production in the West Coast of the United States, States. Both of these awards have one thing, and only one, in common. They have both honors that have been bestowed on our speaker today, Dr. Michael Neff. They mark the two poles of Dr. Neff's work, that of a scientist, and that of an artist. These two fields are traditionally considered incompatible. With Dr. Neff, I would like to challenge that notion. But art relates to design, as science relates to technology. So the two fields are definitely on the same side of an equation. Dr. Michael Neff sees both art and science converging in visualization of data, specifically in data describing human body motions, specifically those dedicated to expression, the human gestures. Dr. Michael Neff is an assistant professor of computer science at UC Davis. His talk today is titled, Animating People, Building Character Systems with Personality. Please help me welcome Dr. Michael Neff.
Thanks, that was great. Okay, thanks very much. I think that's probably the best introduction I will ever get. That's wonderful. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the work that I've been doing with a bunch of collaborators on building character systems. So I'll start by letting you know what a character system is. Quite simply, it's just a computer-controlled, talking, animated character, like this guy over here on the right. And characters are interesting because they're inherently multimodal. Like people, they'll talk, they make gestures, they make facial expressions, they move their body, and so they're communicating over many, many channels at once. So the problem in designing these systems is to generate all of those channels. So you have to determine what the character is going to say, you have to generate appropriate audio, you have to generate lip syncing and facial expressions, you have to generate body movement, and you have to generate gestures. And it's these last two that's really the focus of my work. And so this is what I'm going to be concentrating on today, but I'll touch base with a couple of these other areas as I go. So character systems, I mean, they probably sound kind of cute and that, but why do they matter? Why should we care about them? And I would argue that characters are at the heart of great media. And this goes back to ancient theater, to books, to movies. Characters really are what make media rich. One of the main things that make media rich anyways. And we're increasingly seeing new applications like tutoring and training systems. So you have online health coaches where you may have a character that's trying to change eating habits of teenage girls who are eating too much and not exercising enough, and trying to change these kinds of habits in the culture. You have educational tutors that are trying to teach children how to do math. And there are characters involved in doing this kind of work as we have these sort of newer forms of applications. There are virtual worlds like Second Life, online collaboration systems, new forms of games. Characters also represent a potential new interface, so a new way for people to access computation. What's interesting is we're seeing increasing evidence, and this really isn't surprising at all, that the effect, the emotional qualities of the character and the personality presented by the character have an impact on the effectiveness of the application. For instance, certain people like working with characters that have a similar personality to them. And if you have a mismatch, you can have a decrease in the effectiveness of the application. This isn't really surprising because as humans, we like working with certain people that have particular qualities of personality and particular qualities of emotion, and that's different for different people. Different people collaborate well with different other people. And the same thing seems to apply to characters. So it's probably important to be able to control these qualities in a character system. The other thing that I think is potentially really interesting is we could potentially use these character systems to actually study human communication. And the advantage here is that we have much better control over how our virtual character behaves, and we can make very specific differences in different animation clips that we generate, and then we can use these in perceptual studies to see what people think of them. Okay, so how do we actually go about generating a character? And before I get into that, I'd like to say a little bit about what makes an interesting character, what I would argue makes an interesting character. First of all, we want a character that's going to be natural and believable. We don't want anything jarring in the character that breaks the connection and makes someone suddenly feel like, oh, I'm dealing with a really bad computer system. We want characters that will convey personality and convey mood. And moreover, we want memorable and specific characters. We want people to have rich interactions with their media, rather than having sort of stilted, not really satisfying interactions. We want people to remember the characters afterwards and have that enrich and enliven the overall experience. So how do we do this? Well, artists have been creating these kinds of characters for years, and they do it through a huge amount of manual work. And we see this in animated films, and we see beautiful characters that are created this way. The problem with this is it doesn't scale well to interactive applications. If you have a virtual world, the number of interactions you have makes it prohibitive to pre-script all of those by a really talented artist. So we need some way to control this computationally. And I'll look at two different ways we've been looking at in this talk. One is looking at characters by imitation. And the idea here is we create a character by imitating someone interesting in real life. So we basically pick up their behavior and we copy it in our character system. The second is creating a character based on personality models. So there are models in the psychology literature of personality, and we can use those as basically dimensional controls on a character. So we can have this higher level parameterization of a character. Okay, so I'll start by talking about gesture by imitation, imitating particular individuals. And this is joint work with Michael Kipp, Irene Albrecht, and Hans-Peter Seidel. So the goal of this project was to simply start with a line of text that we wanted a character to say. And then we would output an animated character, and that character would say the text, it would lip sync appropriately, it would raise its eyebrows and do a little bit of facial animation. It would perform synchronized arm gestures. And this is really the main focus of the work, is generating what gestures the character should do and when the character should do them in time. And it would also include some simple head and body movement. And overriding all of this was the goal that we wanted the character to do it in a particular manner or style that matched a particular individual. So we were trying to replicate how a particular person behaved rather than creating generic behavior, because we thought this was a way to create a richer, more interesting character. So there's a little bit of pre-processing involved in the system. We tag the information structure of text. So if you look at this sentence here, the first part, during the battle, is the theme of the sentence, because it's the part that ties this sentence back to the previous sentence. Rebel spies managed to steal secret plans to the Empire's ultimate weapon, the Death Star, is the ream of the sentence. It's the new information that's introduced in this sentence. And the Death Star is a point of emphasis in the sentence, and we call that the focus. And this information is used for determining where to place gestures. Gestures will tend to occur within a ream and generally on a focus. We map our words up to semantic categories. I'll talk about that a bit later. We time the phonemes. These are used for driving the visemes, the lip syncing information. And we did a manual process for this because we were working at the time in both English and German, and it was easier to do it manually. But a lot of this could be done automatically. We also create a model of the target speaker ahead of time. So our subjects, we chose two subjects. One was Marcel Reiwaniski, who is a German talk show host. He hosts a television show on literature, and he has a very animated gesturing style, very naturalistic, a lot of gestures, very fast. And the other we chose was Jay Leno, who has also a very professional gesturing style, a bit more of a clean rhetorical style. So they offered sort of two different points in gesture space. And our input was 18 minutes of video, 9 minutes of each. So that's what we use for building all of our models. Okay, so the first phase of the system is a pre-processing analysis phase. And here we start with our video as input, and we go through this manual annotation phase. And we produce two things out of this. First, we produce an annotated corpora. This is basically just our video data that's divided up into what words are being said, what gestures happen into that. And then we build a database, a gesture lexicon, which is a database of all the gestures that we see during the sequence. From the annotated corpora, we can build a statistical model of how the particular individual speaks. And we also annotate animation data, which is data that's important for capturing the form of the gestures that are made. And I'll talk about all of this in more detail later in the talk. So this is a cost. It's a cost of about an hour, on the order of an hour to 2 hours probably per minute of input video. So there's a cost of doing this annotation up front, but you do it once. And then you have the model and you can generate as much output as you want from the model. So it's a one-time cost. Okay, after we do this pre-processing step, we move to an online generation phase. Here we take, again, new text that the character is supposed to say. We put this into a gesture generation system, and this decides what gestures the character should do and when the character should do it. And it takes as an input one of our profiles of a particular speaker. The output of this is sent on to an animation engine, which will actually realize the animation. And we get an animated character as output. Okay, so now I'll go through the pre-processing stage in more detail, starting with the annotation of the corpora. So to explain this, I have to take a step back and explain a lot of the research that's been done over the past, really about 70 years, going back to the 40s, but especially in the last sort of 40 years or so, on understanding gesture and understanding nonverbal communication. So McNeil and others have divided gesture into different categories. And McNeil has recently argued that these categories are actually dimensions, and all of these dimensions could be present in any given gesture to varying degree. But the main categories are emblematics, and emblematics are gestures that have a really clear, well-defined meaning, like a thumbs up or an OK symbol. Deictics, which are pointing gestures. Iconics, which make a representation of a concrete object. Or metaphorics, which represent something more abstract. So the sense of something being ongoing would be represented with a metaphoric gesture. Then we can also talk about the different forms that gestures take. And there's an interesting question here about, well, are these gesture forms universally understood or culturally understood? Is there a shared vocabulary of gesture forms? And this is certainly true for emblematics. If I do a thumbs up, there's a wide set of cultures that will recognize the thumbs up. There are other cultures that would not recognize the thumbs up. But it's a shared vocabulary. And it appears to be also true for metaphorics. So this is the breakdown of the frequency that we saw in our two speakers of metaphoric gestures, which is what we were really focusing on here. Metaphoric gestures are very, very common in conversational exchanges. The most frequent gesture in both was a cup. A cup is a conduit gesture where you're basically making an offering with a hand. So you're delivering information, you're delivering an object, you're making some kind of offering with the hand. The palm is open and faces up. JL does a lot of pointing abstract, pointing person, hand clap, shrug, progressive. MR's vocabulary, he does some raised index finger, he does a lot of fling downs and a lot of wipes. Beats are just small little taps of the hand and calming gestures. So they have actually reasonably different gesture vocabularies. Just a couple of concrete examples. This is a raised index finger, and this is something that's been reported in the literature, numerous points. This is a progressive gesture. It's the cyclic movement of the arms. And what the progressive tends to denote is some sense of an ongoing process. we were really working on it for a while. It's a sense that something is ongoing. Okay, gesture can also be broken up into phases. These are the phases. The first phase is the preparation. So the preparation phase is basically just getting the person ready to make the stroke, which is the main part of the gesture. So it's just getting everything into position. So the hands get moved to the right position, the hand gets put into the right shape, and the orientation of the hand is set appropriately for the start of the gesture, or start of the stroke. Then the stroke is the meaning-carrying phase, and it generally has the most energy, and it's what conveys the meaning of the gesture. And after this, you may have a retraction phase, where the person goes back to a rest pose before going out and doing more gestures. And anything in square brackets is optional. So the stroke is required, and everything else is optional. So you could go from a stroke to another stroke, for instance, and you can have many different patterns in your gesturing sequence. There's one exception to that, and this is a gesture that's an independent hold. So an independent hold is something like the raised index finger. You have a preparation that moves the hand to there, but then you just hold the hand. There's no movement associated with the stroke, but the meaning is in that pose. Okay, so these phases can get grouped together into what is called a gesture phrase. And then we put a label on this gesture phrase, and this is what we're calling a lexeme, and we call this is a fling down. So these are the different kinds of gestures that our speakers are making. And then these go into our database, and we have this template database of different gestures that we've seen. Okay, so now that we have some representation or some understanding of gestures, we have to actually connect this gesture back to the text. And there's something that is called the lexical affiliate, which is just the concept in the text that relates to the gesture that's being made. And this may not actually be at the same point in time. They can be slightly offset. But it's the concept that's referred to by the gesture. So if I did a pointing gesture, I might be referring to he or you or your, something that I'm saying in my speech. If I was saying working, I might have a progressive gesture, this ongoing gesture. No, I might have a wipe gesture. So we're just annotating that relationship. Because we want to reproduce this in animated form, it's really important to capture some of the spatial information about the gesture sequence. And we do this again with an annotation system. And this is something that varies quite a bit from speaker to speaker. That's why it's really important to capture this information. We annotate 4 dimensions. We annotate the height, the distance out from the body, the radial orientation of the gesture, and the 4th dimension is maybe a little less obvious, but something that's really important. This is the swivel angle. If I was to draw a line from my wrist to my shoulder and rotate around that line, that's the swivel angle. And what it does is it either brings the elbows in close to the body or it moves the elbows out. And this is an important sort of personality parameter. You have characters that are very proud that really put their elbows out, and characters that are really sort of containing space and hold their elbows much more in. Okay, so this is the Amble tool. This is an annotation tool that was developed by Michael Kipp, and it's freely available online. It's what we use for our system. And it has basically all the data that we record on different tracks, and then it's ordered in time. And so each of these blocks is simply an element of data that we've annotated. So the bottom 3 tracks are the gesture phase, the gesture phrase, and then this new thing I haven't talked about yet called the gesture unit. And what the gesture unit is simply a series of gestures before you have a rest pose. So often people will go out and they'll do a gesture, they'll do another gesture, they'll do another gesture, and then they go back to a rest pose. And we group those together into something called a gesture unit. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the animation lexicon, the additional animation data that we need. So this is data that's important for representing these different gesture forms that we have. The first item is forearm and wrist rotation. The orientation of the hand is very important for a gesture. If I have a gesture with my hand up or my hand down, this will generally denote quite a different meaning. So capturing that information is important. The shape of the hand, if I have a pointing hand or if I have a fist, clearly very important. Temporal dynamics refer to gestures that may have an acceleration right at the beginning and then slow down, or gestures that accelerate at the end. Some gestures have a strong posture change associated with them. Not that many, but something like a shrug will have a really clear posture change. And some gestures will have multiple repeated strokes, and this is actually quite important for particular people. They'll do a gesture, and then there'll be these like little echoes that come after the gesture, and so we annotate the form of those echoes so that we can reproduce them in our output animation. Okay, so the next stage is to then build these models of individual speakers. And I'm just going to give you sort of a high-level view of how we do that based on our annotated corpora. First of all, we annotate, we map all of our words up to semantic tags. And this just gives us more statistical power. So if we have a name like Ben Franklin in our text, we'll map that up to person name. And then all the people's names will get mapped to person name. And we do all of our reasoning with person name rather than these individual names. So we have better statistics. And then these are the statistics that go into our profile. The first is a concept to gesture mapping. And so what this says is, what's the probability of a particular gesture form L given that I see a particular gesture tag? So if I see a person name, what gesture form tends to go with that? Gesture transitions represent the odds of going from one gesture into another gesture. So some people will really repeat particular gesture forms. Some people will change gesture forms quite frequently. What hand is used? Either a single hand or a two-handed gesture. And the overall rate of gestures, the number of gestures per minute. And then the odds that they repeat gestures. So they'll give a gesture that will have these afterstrokes, these little repetitions. Okay, so this is then our generation system. So at runtime, what we do is we just plug in one of these profiles. So we can plug in either profile to this engine. And it goes into three stages, and I'm not going to get into the details of this. But basically, we do a little bit of pre-processing. Then we produce the gestures. So we decide what gestures should happen and when. Then we group them together into gesture units. And then this produces a script that gets sent off to the animation engine. And then the animation engine uses this additional animation lexicon data that we've annotated for the gesture forms and produces an output clip. And we also add in some fairly simple body movement, some body rotation and some gaze direction changes. We've actually done a lot more work that I can't present today, just out of time. But we've done a lot more work on adding in body movement, and I can point you to a paper that does some of that. Okay, so the way the animation system works, we basically solve for the poses at stroke boundaries. So at the beginning and the end of the stroke, we'll solve for the pose, and then we interpolate in between. And we use a range of techniques for doing that. We use inverse kinematics, which allows basically positional control over the arms and solves for all the joint angles needed for that. We use physical simulation as a way to create more natural motion. So we can have like pendular motion when an arm falls to a character's side. In this work, we developed a bunch of procedural techniques for creating more complicated gesture form. Gestures like progressive, these ongoing gestures. And we do refinement on gestures to add in repetitions and add in curvature and add in other features to the gesture. So we're able to create more complicated gesture forms, like this progressive cyclic gesture over on the right. We can vary whether a gesture is a very straight line gesture or a very loopy gesture. Create reasonably complicated gesture form. Okay, so this is the final output. This will be JL over on the left and MR on the right.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. It is a period of civil war. Rebel spaceships, striking from a hidden base, have won their first victory against the evil Galactic Empire. During the battle, rebel spies managed to steal secret plans to the Empire's ultimate weapon, the Death Star, an armored space station with enough power to destroy an entire planet. Pursued by the Empire's sinister agents, Princess Leia races home aboard her starship, custodian of the stolen plans.
Okay, so we're interested, and this is older work, and we can do more in terms of animation quality now. But at the time we were interested in, okay, did we actually capture enough that people could recognize the individuals that we were reproducing? So we did a study. We had 26 participants, and we showed them training video of each. A couple of minutes of each speaker, just raw video, so that they'd have an idea of how that person gestured if they weren't familiar with them. And then we gave them two tasks. Task A, we just showed them one of these Star Wars clips, and we said, is this supposed to be based on JL or on MR? And they were right 69% of the time, and this was a significant result. And then we did a side-by-side test, so this is easier. We showed the two side-by-side, and we asked them to label which is JL and which is MR in this task. And then they were right 88% of the time. This was also significant. So following up on that, we were interested in, well, can we actually use this system to understand something about human communication? Because we observed something that was counter to the literature. We observed that both of our subjects actually used long gesture units much more than people thought people did when they spoke. So instead of doing singleton gestures where you do a gesture and you retract, they would do a lot of these longer gesture sequences. And we thought there might be something to that. So this is data by McNeil, who's one of the big researchers in the gesture field. And he had found that with his subjects, who were undergrad psychology students for the most part, their gesture rate, the rate of using singleton gestures, just a single gesture and retract, was very high and quite a fall off as you moved out from there. But this is the pattern that we saw with JL, and even more pronounced with MR, this tendency to use longer gesture units. So we thought there might actually be something to this, and so we wanted to test this experimentally. And so what we did is we generated animated clips where we'd either have singleton gestures or we'd have longer gesture units. And we asked people to rate them on a whole bunch of scales. And this is the results that we came up with from that. The longer gesture unit versions were rated as more natural, more friendly, more trustworthy, with the tendency to be viewed as more competent. The singleton version was rated as more nervous. And this was done in Germany and the US, and we controlled for nationality and speech understanding, and there were no differences there. Okay, so I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk a little bit about another way that we might want to create a character, and this is creating a character with a higher level model of personality. And this is joint work with Marilyn Walker, who's at UC Santa Cruz, and her student Rob Abbott, and my student Yingying Wang. Okay, so the motivation is what we want to be able to do ultimately is we want to control the perception of a character. If we want an extroverted character, because we know we have an extroverted user that is really going to want an extroverted character, we want to know that that's what our character system is going to deliver. It's also potentially an interesting way to do high-level agent authoring. So the amount of time to author all of the details of an agent can be completely prohibitive for a lot of applications. So if we have a small parameter set, we might be able to get something pretty reasonable with a reasonably low amount of work. We also wanted to confirm our psychological findings so humans transfer over to agents, and people make the same kind of judgments on agents as they make on humans. So the basis for this model is something called the Big Five model of personality. It's also called the ocean model, and it has 5 different dimensions to represent personality: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And in this work, we actually only concentrated on one of them. We only concentrated on extroversion. And some of the adjectives associated with extroversion are warm, gregarious, assertive, sociable. With people that are low in extroversion or more introverted, they tend to be shy, quiet, reserved, passive. So the process we took was to first turn to the psychology literature and see what the data said about how does movement actually correlate with these parameters. And then we generated agent behavior based on this. And we performed perceptual studies to see how people perceived these agents. So some of the things we found, introverts will have a higher tendency to lean backwards, turn away from the person they're speaking to. Extroverts will tend to lean forward more. Introverts will have a narrower gesture. Extroverts will make wider and broader gestures. The gesture rate is lower with introverts, higher with extroverts. The gesture speed is slower for introverts. And in terms of body parts, or sort of the posture of the character, extroverts will tend to have their shoulders more erect, their limbs more spread out, elbows away from the body, and legs apart more. So they're taking on a bigger posture. So we converted these into agent parameters, and we had a set of different agent parameters. The first was simply gesture rate. So we either had low or high, and basically the low rate was half the rate of the high rate. And then we took these other parameters and we grouped them into something that we called gesture performance. And so the spatial scale and the position for introverts, we made the gestures smaller and we moved them more inward, larger and outward for extroverts. We shortened the duration slightly for extroverts, which increases the velocity of the gesture. Introverts, we dropped the collarbones down. Extroverts, we raised them up. We bumped the swivel angle out more for extroverts. Introverts would lean slightly back, extroverts slightly forward. And we reduced the amount of body motion in introverts. And we actually had 4 different levels going between most introverted and most extroverted on this set of parameters. Okay, so the text that we used in this was generated by the personage engine, and this was developed by Marissa Walker. Walker's one of the collaborators on this work at Santa Cruz. And it's a natural language generation system based on this Big 5 model of personality. And it works with all 5 parameters, so you can set your parameters and you'll get output text that matches that personality profile, and it's being experimentally confirmed to work as promised. This is an example of just a few of the parameters in it. It's got a very large set of parameters. So for example, verbosity will control the number of propositions in the utterance, and this is low for introverts and high for extroverts. Filled pauses will insert syntactic elements that express hesitancy, words like, I mean, you know. So you might have a sentence that says something like, I mean, Champagne Thai has great service, you know. And this is, again, filled pauses are high for introverts and they're low for extroverts. So these are examples of 2 of the utterances, a low extroversion and a high extroversion utterance. I mean, Amy's bread isn't as bad as the others. And high extroversion, I'm sure you would like Amy's bread. Basically, its price is $12. It's cheap, you know. The food is good and the servers are friendly. And we align gestures with this based on information structure, the same theme, reme, and focus structure that I talked about before. Okay, so we then put this into an experimental study. And what we wanted to look at was the relationship between these verbal channels for expressing personality and the nonverbal channels for expressing personality. So we had 32 clips that we used as stimuli. We had 4 variants of language. We had 2 low extroversion and 2 high extroversion, 2 variants of gesture rate, either low or high, and 4 points on our movement scale from low extroversion to high extroversion. The gesture synthesis, we used a slightly different system for doing gesture synthesis on this. We basically made use of more motion capture data in producing the animation, and we used some editing techniques from some work that we published in 2009. Essentially, we used inverse kinematics to follow the path of strokes that we took from actual motion capture data. And we used motion capture for the body movement combined with some editing operations. For the input, we chose 6 sample gestures, and they all had a fairly similar form. And this is something that's sort of, I think, a really interesting question to look into in a lot more detail, is how gesture form relates to these aspects of personality. But all the gestures were basically cup-like gestures, sort of in between a cup and a beat. So they had fairly neutral form that we could use with the text that we had. And they were initially 25 centimeters, and we just randomly selected those when we generated our output. And to create the low gesture rate, we simply dropped half of the gestures from the high gesture rate clips. And we used, for our animation engine for this, we used Ember to produce our final animation data, or to render our final animation data, which is also a freely available agent toolkit. And we used VoiceWare for our voice. Okay, so in this study, we had 40 subjects. We had 32 males and 8 females. 35 spoke English as their first language. And the experimental task was to judge each clip they viewed in terms of the extroversion displayed in that clip. And we also asked them to rate the naturalness of each clip. And for extroversion, we used something called the TIPI scale, which is the 10-item personality inventory. Basically, it has 2 questions for each of these personality parameters. And it's been shown to be more reliable than single-question surveys. And they would rate each clip on a 7-point Likert scale, and we randomized the clip order for each subject. So this is an example clip, and you can see These are the two Tippy questions down at the bottom. They're asked, is it extroverted and enthusiastic? Is it reserved and quiet? And then to rate the naturalness. You notice that we block out the head. And this is something that we learned in earlier studies, that if we show the head in animations, people stare at the head. And it gets very difficult to get data on body movement variations because people really attune to the facial expressions.
I mean, Amy's bread isn't as bad as the others.
So that's one clip, and you can decide if that's introverted or extroverted.
I'm sure you would like Amy's bread. Basically, its price is $12. It's cheap, you know, the food is good and the servers are friendly.
And this is the other extreme. So we did an analysis of the data we got out of this, and this is what we got for each category individually: gesture performance, gesture rate, and linguistic extroversion. So each factor would independently predict a rating of extroversion on the Tippy scale. So that was kind of neat. We didn't actually have to combine them. Each factor on its own was sufficient to predict extroversion. We did a multivariate linear regression of all three factors, and they show that all factors are significant. And this is a standardized regression equation, and it gives you some idea of the contribution of each. So linguistic extroversion has the strongest contribution, but all three factors contribute to the perception. There is no significant effect of gesture rate or performance on perceived naturalness. But something that was quite interesting is more linguistically extroverted utterances were found to be significantly, so a statistically significant result, less natural. And this was a bit of a result, a surprising result, because we've actually done, or Lynn Walker's actually done experimental work on the text used in the experiment and not found this finding when people just look at the text. But we think possible causes are errors in the text-to-speech with very long utterances, or difficulties in placing gestures accurately with long utterances. So it points at just how difficult it is to really do this kind of multimodal generation. Okay, so we found that all three of our factors, rate, performance, and linguistic variation, allow predictable control over the perception of extroversion. So that's nice. It gives people a good toolkit to use to generate a particular perception. Something we found that was quite surprising is misaligned combination of parameters do not impact naturalness. This is something we actually thought we'd find, that if we had something that was, say, vocally or linguistically very extroverted, but the movement was very introverted, there would be a mismatch and people would find that clip less natural than if we aligned all three parameters. And we didn't actually find that in the study. Okay, so there's a lot more factors to consider. We'd like to look more at the role of gesture form. Voice and prosody is obviously really important, and we're just using a single synthetic voice in all of this. And we would like to actually have control over the voice and control over prosody changes in the speech. And there are a lot of additional gesture movements that we weren't able to include in this study, such as the direction of the gesture. We'd also like to actually break it down and look more individually at the role of all the individual components in the movement and see how significant each component is to the overall impression that's generated. And we'd like to look at more personality dimensions. This just looked at extroversion. Okay, so what are the long-term goals of the work? Well, we'd like to be able to generate health coaches and tutors and characters in virtual worlds or games that adjust their personality and their effect to the current context that they're acting in, and also adjust to users. So as I've mentioned, there's evidence that different users need different characters to have an effective interaction. So we want to be able to adjust our characters to the particular needs of a user. And applications of this would include teaching environments, virtual worlds, collaborative environments, different forms of games and new media. And I think one of the really interesting still open questions is understanding how personality and mood can maximize agent effectiveness. So we're starting to see some evidence that there are these connections between the effectiveness of an application and the personality and effect of the agent, but we don't really understand how to do that. We don't understand, for instance, that if we have someone who we can detect as being more introverted, do they want an extroverted or an introverted character to interact with? There's some evidence on both sides. So we really need to understand how to do this to maximize the effectiveness and understand how much variance we get in the application. Okay, so thanks very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. I have a question and also a remark, inviting your observation. First, I want to congratulate the avatar that introduced you. He looked very real, so he did a very good job there. Now, my question has to do with sign language. In 2005, I joined Second Life and created an island, and one of my dreams was create an avatar that could do sign language, because it's very expensive for people to hire sign language interpreters. I myself don't hear very well, so I would appreciate having sign language everywhere. But so the first question is, can you go somewhere in the direction of creating an avatar that does sign language? The observation has to do with Second Life and some experiments that were conducted. In Second Life, avatars or the owners of avatars can buy gestures and poses. And it was very interesting to know the most popular gestures and poses ever sold and why. Also, we conducted experiments on how people changed the gestures and poses depending on the environment in which they were in Second Life. I myself conducted some experiments. So basically, I'd like to know where are we going with respect to sign language, and secondly, comments on gestures and poses being very popular in some environments.
So let me talk about the sign language issue first. I haven't worked directly on sign language. I have some colleagues that have. So there is work ongoing, and I think it's still pretty much an open problem in creating really high quality sign language generation. And from what I understand, one of the issues with that is the dynamics of the motion. So the timing of the motion is very important to how something is read. And so you need to have systems that really can reproduce that timing. So if you have something that sort of moves slowly or something that moves more quickly, I don't know sign language, but I understand that these are important differences in how a sign is read. There's a lot of work still going on in this, so hopefully, I think that's one direction of all this work in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. Hopefully you'll have much better systems, but I don't think there's anything that's super reliable right now. As for the popularity of gestures in Second Life, I'm not actually sure what the leading gestures were. And I wonder if they're communicative gestures or if they're gestures that are sort of more fun to actually put on a character. One of the issues in Second Life is how do you actually control the animation of your character in real time. So do you have a really clumsy way to control the gesturing, or do you have a more fluid way that's more natural to control? And I think there needs to be work there. And there's been some people that have used prosody to try to drive the gesture stream, which gives you some form of real-time control for the gesture stream.
Thank you. My question was if you... My question was if you could consider doing a conductor with gesture work, because the conductor has to communicate exclusively with gesture.
Yeah.
And if we're there yet, if we could convince an orchestra to play music based on a virtual conductor.
In the Netherlands, there's actually a virtual conductor project where they're doing this, and I don't know if they're actually using it to control an orchestra or not. So I'm not sure if they've sort of completed the loop. I've just seen video of the conductor on its own doing the conducting movement. But it'd be interesting to try. It could be a good test on how well the movements are actually being read.
And another follow-up question, what if that conductor were male or female? Is there a distinction between typically male or typically female gestures that you've come across in your studies? Or not?
There are differences. I can't give you sort of a good classification of the differences off the top of my head, but there certainly are differences between them, yeah. Yep.
You used a 9-minute sample, and
Yeah.
I'm curious how things would change if you were to use a 1-minute or a 1-hour sample. How much do you get in a short amount of time?
So as we have more data, we'll have a much better ability to map that data to language. So we'll have a wider language set that we can sample on. We'll also have a much clearer sense of the specific spatial locations of those gesture forms. If you had a really short sample, if you had a minute sample, someone could do a gesture that's very atypical. And so they might do a lot of, like, Rivnitsky does a lot of gestures like this and a lot of fling down gestures. He really uses this space a lot in his gesturing. But occasionally he'll do something out here. And you could have a 1 minute sample where you had, a couple of gestures out here and did not really characterize what he did at all. So in general, the more data you have, the better with any sort of data-driven approach. But you're just going to stabilize on getting a better pattern of what they do. The interesting thing is also controlling for mood, though. So as someone changes their mood, their gesturing pattern can change. And there are things that are still them about the gesturing pattern, but there are things that have changed based on the mood. So if you had different moods over an hour, or longer data of different moods, that would be very interesting.
I think we have one more question right here.
Yeah, I was wondering if you ever tried to run through a different Jay Leno monologue into the model that it wasn't based on, and then kind of compared how well your model matched what actually happened when you read it. Have you tried to do that?
So we've done a couple of different things. First of all, we did recreations. So we would actually annotate a particular utterance, and then we would run that through, and we would recreate animation based on that utterance. So it shows how much we're recording in our annotation. And we get something that looks pretty close. Our body movement model in this work is very limited, and so the body movement is not very good, but the gesture movement is pretty close and well aligned with what's actually going on. In terms of the statistical generation, we also generated on text of each of our speakers, and in that case, that text clip we did not include in our analysis. So we generated on text that was not part of the input analysis.
We have one last question over here.
Hi, yes. You had touched on, and it looked like you collected data for the naturalness of the gestures. Mm-hmm. Did you try turning that on its head and looking at gestures that were really unnatural and artificial? If you watch some speakers, and newscasters seem to be particularly guilty of this, you can tell that their gestures and are really forced and look very unnatural. Did you try and maybe look at how those are happening and how those are being modeled and compared those to what you're not doing?
That's a really interesting idea, and it's an interesting approach. To be honest, at this point, I think we're at the point where getting something natural is hard enough that we're not looking as much at trying to break the system, because it's really easy to create something that's unnatural. But it'd be a really interesting way to look at sort of what is going on. If we had a natural version and we had an unnatural version, then we could analyze the difference between them. We could possibly learn some really interesting things. Yeah. The body involvement is probably important in that, the way the rest of the body is used with the gesture.
So you had this side-by-side comparison of the two characters. When I looked at that, I kind of felt a little bit of an emotional response to each, respectively. What I'm curious about is that, do you have some sort of data showing that you can use this sort of analysis to create maybe like a virtual gesture coach? Because people get public speaking coaches and things like that. And a little tie-in. And how would covering the face of those change that?
So let me take the covering the face question first. So it was the longer gesture unit test where we first covered the face. And that's when we discovered that our data, we weren't getting very strong data until we covered the face, because people were really paying attention to the face. I mean, I think a good gesture coach needs to know what the person is actually doing. A big part of it is, I mean, you can demonstrate good gestures, and that would be useful, but a good part of it is also having the person really understand what they're doing gesturally, and they may not have a very clear understanding of what they're doing themselves. So I think you'd want to build in some kind of system that would actually observe what the user was doing as well. and provide feedback on that to be really effective. But you could certainly do like a training system that would sort of demonstrate different kinds of gestures that could be used. But then you run into this issue of the gestures possibly looking very fake.
Thank you so much for, you have one more question?
Just a quick one.
Sure, go ahead.
So you said that the personality of the person interacting with the model, would their perception changes, right, based on what the personality of the person themselves is. So what would that look like in real life? For instance, years ago when I got hired by Bloomingdale's, my cash register training was done by a model like that, which was highly annoying.
Oh, okay.
So I'm curious how would you assess that? Would you do like a 5-question personality assessment of the person interacting with the computer to then select one of the different models, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are personality surveys. So there are personality surveys that will rank people based on these same set of parameters. And so you can have someone go through a survey ahead of time, and then you can have a profile of what their personality is based on these factors. And what we're interested in doing is looking at how people with different personalities tend to rate agents as well. So we would have them do something like that ahead of time, and then we would have them go through a user study and see if there's differences in how different personalities rate particular agents.
Okay, well, please join me again in thanking